As an Australian, I realise that I have been propagandised to the hilt most of my life. I discovered this around 2013 after watching a program by independent journalist Abby Martin, her latest offering, The Empire Files. Until this revelation, the widespread global corporate media and their propaganda had led me to believe some rather outlandish lies about the many target countries of US empire. In retrospect, the corporate media has also kept the racist white supremacist narratives on the slow boil for many decades. Thanks to independent journalism, I also woke up to the global corporate media's ongoing efforts to manufacture consent for more war. I realized they were just propaganda arms of the US national security state, the invisible, unelected government that runs seamlessly through each administration. In a nutshell, the aim of this was to assist the world's greatest empire to steal resources and obtain full-spectrum dominance. To call it an empire is appropriate, as it has 800-plus bases worldwide. Since 1945, the US has overthrown the governments of at least 50-plus countries. It has assassinated or attempted to assassinate many world leaders who have become inconvenient to their aim of full-spectrum dominance or were unwilling to be or become a US puppet. The US empire continues to invade and meddle globally with the help of the corporate media, corporate-owned politicians, of which there are many, and with the indispensable help of capitalism's invisible army, the CIA. And for those who are not aware, the CIA has admitted to helping oust one of our best prime ministers Australia has ever had, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. It has been a neoliberal mess ever since. For that alone, I have an axe to grind. But all empires fall eventually. As a human on the planet, I do not want to live in a world where our species and all other species are on the edge of extinction due to the West's rapacious capitalism, and also, and many may not realize this, because most of us are not vegan. I no longer wish to live in a patriarchal system which is becoming increasingly violent, in part due to capitalism, as Lenin noted, being inextricably linked with imperialism, and because end-stage capitalism can only lead to fascism. I no longer want to live in a world where the US government, no matter what major US party, is dictating white supremacist foreign policy to Australia and dragging us into endless wars that are killing millions of people in Western Asia and other countries. I do not approve of any corrupt system which allows a few questionable members of any Western government decide what countries we will invade and what economies and democracies we will destroy. I do not consent to that. These decisions to invade and endlessly occupy countries that have not threatened us are made without any discussion with other elected officials and are made without transparency nor the knowledge of the Australian public. The massive protests throughout Australia against the Iraq War in 2003 were ignored by the Conservative Prime Minister at the time, John Howard. Right now we have weapons industry-funded neocon think tanks like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the ASPI, quote-unquote informing our parliament about China. The ASPI is rapidly promoting a war on China. Their motivation and information is highly questionable. Did any of our Australian politicians see Australian journalist John Pilger's 2016 documentary, The Coming War on China? US Major General Smedley D. Butler, who at the time of his death in 1940 was the most decorated Marine in US history, said, quote, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism," end quote. War is never the answer, and it is clear that these wars have nothing to do with any, quote, threat, end quote, from any of these US-targeted countries. As a global citizen, I am distressed at the ridiculous and dangerous saber-rattling towards China and Russia that Western governments are engaging in at the US government's behest.
We have an adversary, and that adversary is China, and that adversary, unless there is dramatic reform inside China, will be our enemy someday.
One myth I think really that needs to be dispelled is that somehow China is aiming to replace America and going to run the world. It's not. Well, first of all, the Chinese are not that stupid. The West, with its Christian roots, are about converting other people into their beliefs. The Chinese are not about that. It's just I'm not degrading the Western culture. I'm just pointing out the inherent nature, the DNAs of two different cultures. The Chinese, 2,000 years ago, built the Great Wall to keep the barbarians out, not to invade them.
As the world's economic power moves rapidly to Asia, the response of the United States is to deploy the majority of its naval forces to Asia and the Pacific. This massive military buildup is known in Washington as the pivot to Asia. The target is China. The great power game in the 21st century is called perpetual war. For America's unchallenged arms industry, the annual prize is huge profits from almost $600 billion of military spending.
Once an imaginary weapon on Star Wars, the electromagnetic gun is now reality.
You're sitting here thinking about these next generation and futuristic ideas, and we've got scientists who have designed these, and it's coming to life.
And the smartest weapons need enemies.
As a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long-term role in shaping this region and its future. I have directed my national security team to make our presence and mission in the Asia-Pacific a top priority.
In one sense, is the US already at war with China?
Yes, on the ground and in the air. The winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, President Barack Obama, has committed to trillions of dollars to our nuclear arsenal. He's committing trillions of future dollars to war in space. And we need an enemy for all this money, and China's the perfect enemy.
Australian politicians appear to be happily getting behind US national security state narratives like an obedient puppy. Why is Australia provoking China? Because the US empire feels threatened economically by China, it's called competition, and cannot deal with China becoming the next great economic power. The coming war on China has nothing to do with anything else but protecting US capitalist interests as usual. I'm equally disgusted that we have been selling arms to Saudi Arabia while it has been committing a US-backed genocide of Yemeni people. Since 2014, the US has been backing this appalling crime against humanity. Yes, that's right. It wasn't Trump or Bush who originally backed the genocide. It was started during the Obama-Biden administration. The Australian government has been mostly silent for many decades about the atrocious human rights abuses against Palestinians. The Australian government should wholeheartedly condemn the ongoing genocide of Palestinians by apartheid Israel, which has been going on since the Nakba in 1948. At best, it is silent. Why? Because the US uses Israel for its proxy wars, and Israel benefits from $10 million a day of military aid from the US to continue to oppress the Palestinians and to be a proxy for empire. How beholden is the United States to their ally Israel? In May 2021, according to Truthout, 330 members of the US House of Representatives signed a letter late last month insisting that the $3.8 billion in annual military aid the United States provides Israel remain unconditional. However, Human Rights Watch, which often supports US imperialist narratives, takes a different position. In a 213-page report by Human Rights Watch titled A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution, end quote, released in April 2021, condemned Israel, stating, quote, Israel authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution, end quote. Human Rights Watch Australia Director Elaine Pearson said the International Criminal Court needed to investigate. In addition, Ms. Pearson said it was concerning that, quote, Australia recently rejected an International Crimes Court ruling confirming its jurisdiction over Palestine, end quote. As an Australian citizen, I am appalled at our degrading treatment of asylum seekers who are fleeing our endless wars. We are literally making refugees pay for entry into Australia. Through our participation in US imperialist wars and US crippling economic sanctions, we destroy their countries, their homes, their families, their lives, their country's economy, and then when they flee in desperation with their children, if they survive the dangerous voyage, we lock them up indefinitely till they self-harm. In Australia, we have committed a genocide against Indigenous people, and we continue to treat Indigenous people poorly to the point where we have very young Indigenous people taking their own lives. Ask Australian suicide prevention activist Jerry Giorgatis of his experience of this.
I had always taken a view about a formal apology, and that is that I wasn't willing to do it, not because I didn't understand that there had been a lot of injustices, not because I didn't realise that they were a disadvantaged people, and they were and are. And that's a fact of life. I didn't accept the conclusion of the Bringing Them Home report that genocide had been practiced against the Indigenous people. I didn't believe genocide had taken place. and I still don't.
Is it any surprise our government enacts sadistic and racist policies towards black and brown people who flee to our shores? We continue on our white supremacist attitude. And it is not just the conservative authoritarian wannabe government of Scott Morrison that is the problem. The Federal Australian Labor Party and the Australian Green Party are also a problem with its silent complicity supporting US foreign policy. I'm equally appalled at the Australian government's abandonment of Australian publisher journalist Julian Assange, whose only, quote, crime, end quote, was exposing war crimes and political corruption via WikiLeaks. We have delivered him into the sadistic hands of US empire. The Kangaroo Court in the UK allows Assange to rot in the appalling, torturous confines of Belmarsh Prison, despite the poor mental and physical health. The US was embarrassed by Assange's exposure of war crimes, and they, Obama, Trump, Biden administrations, have been determined to make the most extreme example of Assange. As a UK journalist said, the persecution of Julian Assange is the equivalent to putting a severed head on a pike outside the city gates, so no one ever thinks about exposing US war crimes again.
I went to visit him with two medical doctors to have an objective basis, a psychiatrist, a forensic expert. We visited him for 4 hours. We had separate medical examinations and bilateral discussions with me, and all the three of us came to the conclusion that he showed clear patterns of psychological torture. I reported to the UK government thinking, well, this is the UK now. I mean, that's the rule of law. I'm just going to, they're going to investigate and we're going to sort this out and I can go home. Well, home I went, but I waited for 5 months to get this response that I told you about. And that response was just, we reject any allegations of torture. And then, obviously, Julian Assange's state of health deteriorated to the point where I was genuinely afraid he might die in prison. And let me make it very straight. Psychological torture is not torture light. Yeah? Psychological torture aims directly at destroying the personality of an individual by isolating them from all positive influences, by manipulating their feelings, exposing them to constant anxiety and stress, overstimulating their nervous system to a point where the forensic expert explained to me the nervous system simply collapses at some point and takes permanent damage. Some traces of which we could already confirm in those physical examinations. I was just profoundly shocked. I could not imagine a year ago that I would ever get into a situation where a state like Sweden or a state like the UK would refuse to engage with me as the United Nations Special Rapporteur that's mandated by states to investigate cases and to ask questions to them, that they would refuse to engage with me. And then they accuse me of having lost my impartiality because I speak at events like this. Well, they're not inviting me to their offices. And I'd like to inform the public about what the government is doing.
This is what Niels Melzer, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Human Rights Chair, Geneva Academy, and Professor of International Law, University of Glasgow, said about Julian Assange 2 years ago. Mr. Assange showed clear signs of prolonged psychological torture. First, I was shocked that mature democracies could produce such an accident. Then I found out it was no accident. Now I am scared to find out about our democracies, end quote. Australia continues to persecute whistleblowers like David McBride, the Afghan Files, as well for exposing war crimes. The US repeatedly persecuted whistleblower Chelsea Manning with 7+ years in prison, mostly solitary, including imprisoning her and fining her $400,000 for not becoming an accessory in the persecution of Mr. Assange. The US government is persecuting numerous whistleblowers who are facing long-term imprisonment for exposing war crimes. Daniel Hale comes to mind. The US continues to hold in solitary confinement numerous Black Panther Party members. Some have been in mostly solitary confinement since the 60s and 70s. I could go on about the almost endless human rights abuses within the US, but instead, I would like to direct your attention to Pulitzer Prize recipient Chris Hedges' interviews and also the independent media program, The Empire Files with Abby Martin and Mike Preisner, which can be found online. There are Australians today who are still under the misapprehension that we are on the, quote, good side, end quote. Many of us believe it is important to have the US as an ally. I guess if one considers Mafia like, quote, protection, end quote, important, because that is what it amounts to. But according to a Morgan poll in late 2020, more than 80% of Australians are not happy about our participation in these wars. Every year, Australia honours those who were simply cannon fodder in World War I, the Anzacs. We uphold and put on a pedestal soldiers who go to countries, occupy and invade on lies for resources. Our government continues to keep the whole Anzac legend alive in order to keep militarism in the public's mind as, quote, noble, end quote. After all, we need more cannon fodder to keep our rapacious ecocidal end-stage capitalist system going, don't we? We honour alleged war criminals in the SAS like Ben Roberts-Smith, see the Afghan files. We Australians like to tell ourselves these, quote, war crimes, end quote, are an aberration. We tell ourselves these soldiers are just, quote, bad apples, end quote, or we make excuses for them. Anything but own up to the truth that this is normal behaviour by the US military and by many in our own military. It is a culture.
The helmet camera footage you're seeing is from the SAS patrol dog handler. And what you will see next could result in charges of war crimes. The dog handler heads out into the lead with the patrol scout, who we'll call Soldier C.
Hey, Sam's over there.
They are being guided by the two Black Hawks ahead, whose crew have spotted a man in a field. The dog, named Quake, is then let off the leash.
Hey, come! That's in a car! Hey, down!
The dog handler's gun is trained on a figure in the distance, who drops down into the field. At the field, the dog handler and Soldier C come across a young man amongst the wheat, who's trying to fight off Quake.
Quake! Leave! Quake!
In the man's hand appears to be a set of red prayer beads. No weapon or radio can be seen. The Afghan is compliant and quiet on the ground.
Down!
As the dog is called off, Soldier C trains his weapon on the Afghan from very close range. He then turns to the dog handler.
I don't know, mate. Drop this gun! Quake, no! Quake! Stop! Leave! Quake! Leave! Heal.
3 shots from close range. The Afghan is dead, and Soldier C walks off.
No! Heal!
The whole thing, from landing to killing, takes less than 3 minutes.
Collateral damage, a war crime exposed by whistleblower Chelsea Manning in 2007 via WikiLeaks, is not an aberration. According to veterans speaking out against US imperialism, mowing down Iraqi citizens by Apache helicopter or AC-130s, the Angel of Death, or by soldiers on the ground is an almost daily occurrence. Free fire zones is one term for it. Terrorizing the civilian population in multiple countries in Western Asia is a normal and daily occurrence. Droning wedding parties or funeral processions and then, quote, double tapping, end quote, those who come to their aid. It is all part of the terrorist activities of empire. The majority of drone strike killings are everyday civilians, including hundreds of children. Ask Iraq War veteran Michael Preisner, who was producer of the Empire Files. Michael Preisner realized that it was he who was the terrorist and occupier.
Sisters and brothers, thanks everyone for being here. We're from the organization March Forward. We're here to say to all those serving in the Army, and the Marines, and the Air Force, and the Navy, that you have the absolute right to refuse to take part in these criminal wars, and that's a right that all of you should exercise. You have no reason to go put your life on the line and kill and die for profit. We've been to Iraq. We've been to Afghanistan. And we know what these wars are really about. And we joined the military for many reasons. Because we need a college education. Because we need a job. Because we need health care. And then we joined the military. And they tell us that our enemies are poor people in caves in Afghanistan. Or poor people in the deserts of Iraq. But we've been to those countries. And we know that our enemies are not other poor people abroad. Our enemies are the people that laid us off from our jobs. That denied us health care. That make it impossible to alone are costing over $700 million every single day. This is a crime every single day, while so many of us are hurting. Well, I think all of us here and the vast majority of people in this country would agree that we can spend $700 million a day better than bombing people that we have no reason to bomb. We can spend $700 million a day rebuilding those countries we've destroyed. We can spend $700 million a day caring for the veterans we get home when they get home, and then we can spend $700 million a day giving every single person health care, a college education, a job, and a livelihood, and a home. That's what we need to be spending our money on. But this government is not going to do that. They're not going to use the money in that way. They're not going to end the wars. And they're not going to do it because it's not our government. It's their government. It's a government of the rich. It's a government of Wall Street, of the oil giants, of the defense contractors. It's their government, and the only language that they understand is shutting down business as usual. And that's what we're doing here today, and we're going to continue to do until these wars are over. It's crystal clear now that these wars are going to continue and expand and go into other countries. That is the trend. That is what we know, that there is perpetual war, and it's only going to stop if the people stand up and stop it. And that's what we're going to do, sisters and brothers. A lot of people ask me, what do we do? Because we all know things are bad. We all see the atrocities on TV. We read about it. We experience it. People always ask, what do I do? Because we always want to know what to do. Do we vote? Do we support a politician? Do we join an organization? What do we do? Well, I'll tell you what we do. It's simple. We fight. We fight and we fight and we fight, and we shut down our workplaces. We shut down our schools. We shut down the streets. We shut down business as usual, and we fight until we force the people in there to do what the people out here want. Because that's how we're going to go on, and we're going to fight until there's not one more bomb drop, not one more bullet fired, not one more soldier coming home in a wheelchair, not one more family slaughtered, not one more day of U.S. imperialism. So let's fight to make that happen. We can do it today, and in the days ahead, we have to fight to end these wars and create a better world, sisters and brothers.
Our corporate media, Silicon Valley, most of our politicians would say anything other than admit to the fact that we are involved in daily crimes against humanity. Our participation in any of these wars is in itself a war crime, period, because war is a crime. Look how the US bombed the civilian population of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan, with nuclear weapons, maiming and killing tens of thousands, even though Japan had already decided to surrender.
The bomb weighed 9,000 pounds and was as powerful as 12,500 tons of TNT. The bomb exploded within 100 feet of the target. The fireball was 18,000 feet across. The temperature at the center of the fireball was as hot as the surface of the sun. Near the center, people became nothing. Near the center, there was no sound. Like a sheet of traveling sun, eyes turned up to the bomb melted. Within 9 seconds, 100,000 people were killed or doomed, and 100,000 more injured. Within 9 seconds, the city caught fire. Asphalt and steel burned like paper. Then the day grew black with smoke and dust. Over the city rose a cloud of smoke 40,000 feet high. 2 hours later, drops of black rain, the size of marbles, began to fall.
Why do we think the US is a, quote, force for good, end quote? Read William Bloom's Killing Hope, or A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, or Pulitzer Prize recipient Chris Hedges' America, the Farewell Tour. Through media sector deregulation over decades, both major Australian political parties have enabled conservative billionaire Rupert Murdoch to help control public debate and even help choose our prime ministers and also manufacture consent for the next war. We have allowed Murdoch to control most of our media, and at the same time we do our best to destroy any kind of semblance of press freedom and democracy by allowing a rapacious, sadistic, insatiable empire get their hands on an Australian citizen and publisher journalist, Julian Assange. It is beyond shameful. The silence of most of our Australian politicians indicates that their careers appear to be more important to them than democracy and peace. They care little about a father whose 2 young children and partner Stella Morris he rarely sees, and if Assange is extradited to the US, it is essentially a death sentence. Where is even any discussion of these endless wars by the corporate media or by any of our politicians? We have no real fourth estate to speak of. Any debate anywhere is virtually non-existent. Speaking out against US imperialism is apparently verboten in our political sphere, and it is all but absent in Australian society. What does that say about us? It says democracy is in its death rattles. It says we are lost. It says we are heading toward a spiritual death. We are fast becoming what many claim we abhor. What this says is that we are infected with the same cancer, the same lack of empathy, and the same fascistic tendencies that have become a feature in the US. Look at the countries that are close allies of the US empire, the head-chopping monarchy of Saudi Arabia and the ethno-supremacist apartheid state of Israel.
Part of the Saudi monarchy's vision of human rights for the world includes, among other things, cutting lots of people's heads off with swords, right in the middle of the street. Saudi Arabia is one of only 4 countries in the world that still practices public executions, and has already executed more than 100 people in the first 6 months of 2015, mostly by ISIS-style beheadings at a rate of 1 every 2 days. So many, in fact, that the government posted a new job listing for 8 additional executioners earlier this year. Saudi courts regularly hand down death sentences for things like sorcery, adultery, armed robbery, blasphemy, homosexuality, and drugs. Methods to carry out executions are gruesome: beheading, firing squad, or stoning to death. Non-violent drug offenses account for a shocking 43% of all executions. But when beheadings aren't terrifying enough, the kingdom's depraved elites resort to crucifixions.
And yet this is the country we are allowing to dictate through fear our foreign policy. Is this the kind of country we want Australia to become? A smaller version of the US, a country which, at this point, is a failed state and displays the 14 defining characteristics of fascism. As an imperialist-pushing anti-China professor, Mears Scheimer, said on a visit to Australia,
if you want to understand, the United States is a ruthless great power. It does not tolerate peer competitors. Now, the question is, what does this all mean for Australia? You're in a quandary for sure. Everybody knows what the quandary is. And by the way, you're not the only country in East Asia that's in this quandary. You trade a lot with China, and that trade is very important for your prosperity. No question about that. Security-wise, you really want to go with us. It makes just a lot more sense, right? And you understand that security is more important than prosperity, because if you don't survive, you're not going to prosper. Survival is of the utmost importance because you can't pursue any other goals if you don't survive, right? So security's got to be number one. So you'll sacrifice prosperity for security, right? That's what will happen. That's why you'll be with us. Now, some people say there's an alternative. You can go with China, right? You have a choice here. You can go with China rather than the United States. There's 2 things I'll say about that. Number one, if you go with China, you want to understand you are our enemy. You are then deciding to become an enemy of the United States. Because we're talking about an intense security competition. You're either with us or against us. And if you're trading extensively with China and you're friendly with China, you're undermining the United States in this security competition. You're feeding the beast from our perspective. And that is not going to make us happy. And when we are not happy, you do not want to underestimate how nasty we can be. Right? Just ask Fidel Castro.
and I paraphrase, you are either with us on China or you are against us, and if you are against us, then you can expect to become like Cuba. That was his arrogant threat. In reality, the world is fast becoming a multipolar world, and this is something that US empire cannot accept. China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries, including even Germany, are realizing the threat and that the US empire cannot be trusted. They are becoming allies. China is helping build up economies while the US is tearing them down. Eventually, the multipolar world will isolate the bully and put it in its corner where it belongs. China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, and other countries that are targets of the US understand that they need to be in solidarity with each other. Otherwise, the US will pick them off one by one, as it has done in the past. It is in their best interest to band together. It is only logical. And here's something Australia needs to understand. It is in Australia's best interest to join in solidarity with these countries and move toward a more peaceful, equitable, cooperative world. It might seem unthinkable to leave the US alliance, but it is an imperative that needs to be done, and soon. Of course, every country has its problems. Democracy is in bad shape throughout the world, but no state is causing anywhere near the violence that the US is. Their annual military budgets are staggering, yet they have abandoned their citizens. The duopoly, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, will not even give their citizens free healthcare in a pandemic or give them a basic living wage. The militarized police execute black people on a regular basis on the flimsiest of pretexts. George Floyd was just one of hundreds of black people who have been executed by militarized police. The National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, allows the state to arrest and lock up U.S. citizens without counsel indefinitely and even assassinate them. The U.S. has dozens of hate groups throughout the country. Their last president, President Trump, bragged in front of a massive crowd about ordering the execution on September 3, 2020, by the state police of a U.S. citizen, Michael Reynolds.
And the man that shot another innocent man, this was an innocent man shot, killed, instantly killed. They said, what happened? Well, we haven't arrested him 2 days, 3 days went by. We sent in the U.S. Marshals. Took 15 minutes, it was over. 15 minutes, it was over. We got him. They knew who he was. They didn't want to arrest him. In 15 minutes, that ended.
Trump incited an insurrection, a coup at the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, in a final attempt to remain in power. He expanded the existing wars and increased the carnage tremendously. I could go on, but something we need to understand is that President Trump was just empire with the mask pulled off. These fascistic tendencies are only becoming stronger and are being carried on by the current president, Joe Biden. The US has interest. It does not have allies. It has said as much, and we should believe them. The US wants full-spectrum dominance at any cost and by any means necessary, and that is not hyperbole. We could all end up in a mushroom cloud because, rather than accept a multipolar world, the US, depending on how unhinged the politicians are, may decide to just end everything. Who knows? Or it could simply happen by accident. If Australia and the rest of the world do not want to be sucked further into this widening black hole, and if Australia does not want to continue being on the wrong side of history, then we need to act now and stop sleepwalking into this nightmare. As Martin Luther King Jr. said 11 months before he was assassinated by the FBI, and I paraphrase, there are three evils: racism, poverty, and militarism. Quote, somehow these three evils are tied together, the triple evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. The great problem and the great challenge facing mankind today is to get rid of war. We have left ourselves as a nation morally and politically isolated in the world. We have greatly strengthened the forces of reaction in America and excited violence and hatred among our own people, and that was May 10th, 1967. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for those positions. Anyone who threatens empire, just like Assange, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., the Black Panther Party, etc., is likely to feel empire's sadistic wrath. The U.S. national security state has no qualms about assassinating presidents if they threaten the CIA, which JFK did, or cause them to think they will interfere with the military-industrial complex, which JFK also did. Eisenhower warned of the problems associated with the military-industrial complex in the 1950s.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Finally, in case one hasn't gathered, all these issues are related. I am deeply saddened and tired of living in a system that is anti-human and anti-non-human, an end-stage capitalist system where we have to beg over and over to save the planet from corporate pillaging and environmental destruction, where we have a sense of learned helplessness in the face of endless war and corporate crimes against the planet. It is pitiful and shameful that many have to vote in a dysfunctional system where many politicians are openly corrupt, where there is no recourse, no accountability, and where many serve corporations and have little interest in serving the people. The Australian people and many people in countries globally, they are tired of the immoral austerity imposed by neoliberalism, which works perfectly for the billionaires, the 1%, the capitalist class. Neoliberalism is ecocidal and is an expression of fascism. Time for us to evolve past this destructive, patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist system and have a vision and move toward a new, peaceful and just world. The new world should, as a moral imperative, also include ending our exploitation and killing of trillions a year of non-human sentient animals by going vegan. No system is going to save us. Only a true transformation within each of us will save us and bring peace. May there be peace for all. It starts with each one of us.